Thank you so much, Liz. And of course, thank you everyone for joining us this, I can't say it's bright and sunny. It's a little gray and gross here in Seattle, but this beautiful morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from the globe. For our regular webinar followers, this is the time of the quarter when we talk about our last internet security report. This quarter, we're talking about Q2 now that we're in Q3. And we'll cover all kinds of trends from the latest malware trends, network attacks being caught by IPS, endpoint related trends, and phishing and compromised website trends. One thing I would like to share, Liz talked about questions at the end, but since both me and Mark are presenting today, if you go ahead and use the question panel during, if a question's relevant to the presentation, we'll definitely keep an eye on it during the presentation and try to answer your questions live too. Before we dive right in, my name's Corey Nachreiner. I'm the Chief Security Officer, pretty much the same as the CISO2 at any organization here at WatchGuard. That does mean I help run security at WatchGuard, as well as some historical stuff me and Mark do as part of the CTO office, which is thought leadership, our threat lab research team, and more. But my right-hand man running our enterprise security is Marc, so I'll hand it off to you, Marc.
Yeah, and I want to start out by saying I just saw a comment saying it's great to see Marc again. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great to be back again.
Hey, thanks
I'm gonna
for
pad
not
that
mentioning.
ego right from Corey. Everyone's
Yeah.
you. Parentheses and Corey. Okay, thank you, Ali. Anyway, so like Corey said, I help run both our internal security operations team while still overseeing our threat research team called the WatchGuard Threat Lab. And that's really where this report originates. Corey and I started doing this, man, we just had a chat about this like 6.5 years ago, I think Q4 of 2016 or so. Back then
and it was just
Corey
you and me writing that first report, yeah.
Yeah, man, that was a lot of work, which thankfully now we've got a whole team to assist us along the way. We divvy up responsibilities for individual sections. We tend to get great views every quarter from our different researchers over the data they've been assigned to try and find interesting trends amongst the weeds of all the threats out there. So could not do this on our own, despite the fact that it's just Corey's and my mugs that you get to look at today while we chat about the results.
Yeah, I'll say it's gone from us creating the whole report to really the majority being these three co-authors. So don't let us take all the credit. These guys are doing most of the heavy lifting for us. So what are we covering today? Well, if you're used to the ISR report, you kind of know, but we start by talking about the Firebox feed trends. Marc will tell you a bit more about what the Firebox feed is, but that is really network-based security trends. Really, all of this report comes from quantifiable data that we get from our products. We do opt-in models, so you do have to opt into allowing us to see this data. And as you'll hear, it's anonymized, so we recommend you do it. But most of what we concentrate in the Firebox feed trends are things like the top malware, or sometimes the most interesting malware, the top network attacks, which we mostly discover through IPS, and of course, things like the top malicious domains through services like DNS Watch primarily for this, but we also have other things like Web Blocker. Now that we own a endpoint security product, WatchGuard EPDR, we do also take a look at the trends, the endpoint-based trends, and that is mostly malware related. It is very interesting to look at the difference between network and malware, and during this talk, we'll talk about how the malware you see at the endpoint might differ a little and why. And finally, though, the point of this isn't just to kind of show all the bad stuff attackers are doing and freak people out. What we're really trying to do is to learn from these trends. I would say the theme of this quarter's report is stirring the pot. One of the things I'll warn you before we go in this quarter, if you followed last quarter, our Q1 report, the first one for this year, we changed the way we do some of our statistical analysis. Once we have all our data, we're using the same exact data, but we decided to do a bigger job of getting rid of outliers, the one or two endpoints or fireboxes that seem to see a very unusual amount of activity compared to the rest of the world. We decided to consider those outliers and cut them out and normalize the data more so that the averages you see probably better represent all of the fireboxes or endpoint installs out there. So in Q1, we did that just for the malware section of the report. In this particular Q2 report, we've done that same kind of outlier removal for pretty much all the sections. And we stirred the pot. We're doing this to kind of really try to find what the trends are, to see if there's anything new we can find in a report. But the result you'll find is also that our history and some of the numbers we report are going to be quite different. So our historical view will take a few quarters to build up to kind of more normal differences between quarters. So expect a lot of change and churn in some of the data we share during this report. With that said, why don't we jump right in and let's talk about the Firebox feed trends. But before we do, why don't you describe what that is, Marc?
Yeah, and like I said, we've been doing this for 6.5 years with webinars every time, so I'm sure a few of you have probably heard this spiel before, but to our new attendees, if you're not familiar with the Firebox feed, like Corey said, it is our anonymized opt-in threat intelligence feed that we get from WatchGuard customers deploying Fireboxes throughout the world. Now, if you do manage your own Firebox appliance, it's under the general settings, you have a little checkbox that says send device feedback to WatchGuard. This provides some information about service usage to our product management teams so they can figure out where to best focus engineering efforts. But it also enables the Firebox to send telemetry back anytime one of these signature services detects and blocks a threat. We get information on the type of threat that was blocked, the service that blocked it, whether or not it arrived over an encrypted connection or not. And we take all of that information, distill it down, find the trends, and then talk about it in this report. It's broken down into our 3 layers of anti-malware. So the signature-based gateway antivirus that still does a great job of quickly catching known threats, backed up by intelligent AV, which is the machine learning, or I guess it's 2023, so I have to call it artificial intelligence now, anti-malware engine that can quickly predict whether something is good or bad. And then the final layer of anti-malware APT blocker that will send it to a secure cloud sandbox and detonate it and watch for the actual behaviors and then alert whether it's good or bad. Beyond anti-malware, we also have the intrusion protection service, or IPS, looking at network-based attacks. This could be an attack against a exposed network service or a client that connects over a network connectivity to a potentially malicious server, as an example. We get whole breadth of visibility into those styles of attacks. And then the last addition in the Firebox feed comes from DNS Watch, our DNS firewalling service, where we primarily get a view threats around phishing and phishing links targeting potential victims. But also we get a great view of malware botnet command and control connections, and even just straight up malware distribution through that feed too. So that's the Firebox feed. Beyond that, like Corey mentioned, we'll talk about endpoint threats as well. But for time's sake, let's jump into the high-level takeaways from the Firebox feed this quarter. And one of the key trends we saw was a pretty drastic swing in the types of malware that we were seeing in volume across our 3 anti-malware services. So overall, malware detections were slightly down quarter over quarter from the previous one when we look at the number of detections per device deployed out there. But the total detections per device, or the ratio, the number there, was still 1,177 average detections per Firebox, which over the course of a quarter, that's a significant number of threats per device every single day that the Firebox is detecting and filtering out. When we look at the signature services that found those particular threats, we saw like some pretty drastic swings, like I just mentioned. So basic anti-malware detections by gateway antivirus were up 41% quarter over quarter to just about half of the detections that we saw when we look at the per device number. Intelligent AV, so the AI model that can quickly identify and block threats, also went up even more dramatically, 113% quarter over quarter. While the cloud sandboxing engine, APT blocker, was actually down 52% quarter over quarter. Some of this can be explained with just how the Firebox layers malware detection when it's looking at any given file. It's going to go through gateway antivirus first. And if that says that it's malware, it stops right there and it blocks the threat. If gateway antivirus doesn't have a signature, maybe it's an evasive threat or something brand new, it then goes to the intelligent AV engine. Intelligent AV will run it through the model. And if it comes back with a strong certainty of it's malware, it blocks it right there and it doesn't go on any further. If intelligent AV comes back and maybe it's not certain on whether it's bad or good, it then goes to APT blocker for that final layer of protection. So if intelligent AV and gateway antivirus are both up in terms of their efficacy from the quarter, maybe we had slightly less evasive threats, it would make sense why fewer things would trickle down to APT blocker, and that might cause its detection rate to go down slightly. Now that Corey is done playing with his toys, though, we'll move on to another interesting high-level stat from the malware section of the Firebox feed.
Yeah, and unlike my toys, this is actually an important point. One of the big things we do every quarter is see how much of a malware and threats arrive over encrypted connections, specifically TLS SSL. So as you know, when you're browsing the web nowadays, almost everything you do is encrypted. I don't have the last statistics on hand, but I think it was something like 95% of the top 1,000 sites on the internet are always encrypted. So that means if you're not using a very cool Firebox capability, one that's actually free, by the way, it takes setup, but regardless of whatever license you have, we have a HTTPS service, which is a application layer gateway to decrypt encrypted traffic. And it does so by basically, you can either import your corporate certificate or export another certificate to your clients. I recommend importing your own. And then we can kind of do a good guy man in the middle to be able to not see what your users are doing. We're not trying to snoop on users, but we are trying to do the malware scans within that traffic. And as you can see by this stat, while very few boxes do this, on the ones that do, 95.6% of the malware being detected is happening over that encrypted connection. So when you look back at those numbers Marc just gave you, some of those numbers come from encrypted traffic, but I would say only about 20%. You know, I think Trevor tells us anywhere from 17 to 22%, it fluctuates, of our customers are using this feature. And that means if you're seeing something like 1,177 pieces of malware on all of these boxes, but they're not looking at encrypted traffic, they're still missing 95% of the malware out there. So the two takeaways there, obviously, we keep on recommending you do this. It does take a little work to set up, and because of some apps that like to do certificate pinning and other things, you do have to do exceptions for certain cases. But doing this will help protect you because most of the malware is coming through it. So definitely do it. The other hint I will give you, though, is until we can see more boxes telling us what's happening here, some of our high-level top trends that are happening over unencrypted connections probably aren't telling the full story. So when we share data about the malware that happens over encrypted connections, that's probably more like what's happening, you know, very commonly out there, because most of the traffic out there is encrypted. Another interesting thing we look at with these high-level trends is something we call zero-day malware. Now, I always have to be careful to define this because the industry has very specific definitions for just 0 day alone. 0 day is usually a vulnerability in a product that hasn't been fixed, and that's why it's called 0 day. And it's 0 day because bad guys can take advantage of it till it's fixed. But when we're talking about 0 day malware, what we mean is malware that evades signature-based detection. A lot of legacy security controls use patterns to catch malware that they already know about. But what if no one's seen that malware before? How can a signature catch it? Well, obviously it can't catch it. And that's why we call this 0 day malware. If you're mostly relying on signatures to catch it, malware will get right past things like gateway antivirus, which is primarily signature based. So you need more advanced things like APT blocker, which is behavioral based malware detection, like Marc mentioned, or intelligent AV, which is machine learning based malware protection. One of the big highlights of this report, although I actually think we're going to change this because it might be our calculations too, is our 0-day malware number. You might think it's 89% because you're used to this being in the 70s. It actually was only 11% in unencrypted traffic this quarter. So it dropped from the 60s and 70s all the way down to 11%. Now, one caveat, I learned that during this report, we calculated that number only using our APT blocker service compared to Gateway Antivirus. We also have Intelligent AV, and I consider Intelligent AV, which is the one that caught 503 of those 1,177 samples, that is proactive signature-less detection. That uses machine learning. So honestly, I think 0-day malware should be a combination of APT and Intelligent AV. So look forward into the next report. This might go back to the 60s or 70s because I think we really should be both those malware services, unlike Gateway Antivirus, catch malware without signatures. They can catch it day one. So that number might be deceivingly low. But no matter how we calculated this unencrypted 0-day malware, one interesting thing is, again, encrypted traffic. We also look at how much of malware in the encrypted connections needs something more than GAV to catch it. And even using APT blocker alone, that went up to 66%. So that tells me that not only are threat actors using encrypted connections to hide their malware from services that don't do deep inspection in encryption, it also tells me that they have some of their more sophisticated signature evading threats being pushed through those encrypted connections. So definitely a good thing to know. And I'll transfer it back to Mark, and instead of playing, I'll check some of the questions while you're talking.
There was one question that came up was, where is the setting again to give you this info, which I believe is in the context of that HTTPS inspection. Now, if you're looking for it in the product docs, the key phrase you're looking for is HTTPS proxy content inspection. Our product documentation walks through exactly how to configure it, including different examples of certificate management in the environment. So hopefully that can get you on the right track for enabling this feature to protect malware, whether it arrives over an encrypted connection or not. There was another question that popped up saying, does WatchGuard customer service help with possible malicious IPs communicating with your red box? I'll note that there are several different security services on the Firebox that can block known malicious connections. Everything from the botnet connection blocking list, whatever the heck it's called, web blocker with reputation filtering can as well too. Reputation enabled defense is another source. Most of the Firebox security services can block a malicious IP address from connecting to your Firebox. In the context of customer service, they typically won't be able to assist you with like specific individual threat actors. I'd say leverage a managed service provider or one of our partners to assist with that investigation. But they can at least help get your services up and running if you're having any issues with those. So with that said, moving into a few of the top specific threats for the quarter, we highlight quite a few in the report itself, and for time's sake, I won't go into all of them, but there's two I wanted to chat about from the top 10 list here specifically. First one is a dropper file that came in at number 2 on here, Linux ZorDDoS.at. This was an interesting malware payload in that it was a botnet malware that specifically targeted Linux servers, and it spread over exposed SSH access. So SSH being the encrypted command line communication to a traditional Linux server. If you had it exposed to the internet with a weak set of credentials on it, this particular malware botnet would go around and try and brute force its way in. Once it gained access to that server, it would look for any additional authentication credentials that are saved on it, like SSH keys to other servers in the organization, if that was a jump box, or any cache credentials in any location it could find. It would attempt to continue spreading. And all of these infected devices, it adds it to a botnet that the threat actor then either uses themselves or more likely leases out on an underground forum to launch DDoS attacks against other victims. Now, the second interesting threat came in at number 8 and number 10, two different variants of effectively the same malware, which we've labeled as Linux Lucifer. due to its relation to another malware variant called Windows Lucifer. This one is both a typical style of botnet that also includes additional payloads to try and mine cryptocurrency on the infected devices, specifically Monero. If you're not familiar with Monero as a cryptocurrency, it's one that is primarily mined using a computer's CPU versus a computer's GPU, like things like Bitcoin or Ethereum, which makes it a very popular, crypto mining
can
payload.
really slow things down even more, right? Because at least if your GPU is being taxed, you can still do normal computing, but if it uses your CPU, it's pretty ugly for resources.
And this one makes it even uglier in that it specifically goes out of its way to find other resources on your computer or other processes on your computer that might be using up resources, and it'll go and kill them. So it looks for like running Python scripts and kills them. It looks for other services that are using high amounts of memory or CPU resources and kills them too, which is interesting because most crypto miners, they try and fly in under the radar and remain undetected for as long as possible. Yeah, maybe they won't have access to the entirety of your CPU power, but they can still earn, a few pennies per month, which at scale adds up to a decent amount of money for the threat actor. So this one going in and kind of blasting everything else just to try and get the most out of its potential crypto mining is interesting, because it also means it's easier to detect when something suddenly breaks on your server and you go and investigate. It's kind of out of line for what typical crypto miners try to accomplish. So those are just two of the interesting ones. We've got quite a few others that we go into in the report. Highly recommend checking them out. But Corey, do you want to pivot over to the network attack section now?
Yeah, but before I do, a couple things. I did find it actually interesting that of our top 10 by volume, 4 of them were Linux-based, as I think you mentioned. I mean, Windows machines get hammered a lot for being the ones that malware tends to target. There is Mac malware out there, but it's still pretty low volume. So seeing Linux, it reminds you that Linux machines are also very targeted. These guys are looking for servers, these threat actors. Even these coin miners, usually probably heavy resource servers. The fact that they're killing all your apps kind of stinks. But just remember, if you do have Linux servers out there, it seems like they're being targeted right now. Also, before we transition to network, one of the questions I thought kind of disappeared. I didn't know is that one you were going to take, Marc?
I had already answered that one, Corey. We're good.
Oh, gotcha. Another question was, do we use our SD-WAN feature with other firewall vendors? Our SD-WAN features currently are kind of managed. They're not cloud-based SD-WAN features, and they're managed between our devices. So we can do a lot of cool traffic shaping, load balancing in our VPNs when you set up mesh networks. But I don't think, we do have a lot of features that are interoperable with any sort of network security router out there, whether they're a firewall, a UTM, a next generation firewall like IPS and stuff like that. Those are pretty interoperable, but our SD-WAN is really meant for our devices to our devices. So with that, let me go ahead and I'll clear that later. Oops, sorry, PowerPoint slowing down. Next, let's talk about network attacks. And our network attack data is mostly driven by our intrusion prevention service. And as you can see here, this quarter, in Q2, I should say, last quarter, Firebox on average blocked 93 network attacks. And that's, if you look at our kind of overall trends of IPS hits over the past kind of 6 reports, it has dropped significantly. Although I think the biggest drop is, especially this quarter, it dropped quite a bit. And that's mostly due to us getting rid of outliers. It turned around, and again, remember, outliers are sometimes we will see 1 or 2 fireboxes that have this huge lion's share of hits. You might see 100,000 of the same signature hitting just on a couple fireboxes. What we believe might be happening with outliers like that are false positives that the owner of the firebox hasn't tuned out yet. If one question to these owners is, if you ever have a firebox that has 100,000 hits on a signature, that's kind of a point to you to be checking your IPS and going and figuring out what that is, because it's either a very persistent attack or a false positive. So you definitely should go research if your Firebox is hitting anything in very big numbers. And if it's a false positive, a very easy thing you can do is make that signature exception, and then it will drop it. But again, by getting rid of the outliers, those few devices that have a ton of hits, the amount of volume we see looks a lot lower, even though it's still there in the data, but it does translate to about 93 attacks per Firebox. Not a huge number, but still, I'm glad that we blocked almost 100 attacks for each device out there. Lots of stuff you can talk about in the top 10, but I think I'll let Marc just talk about one of the new and notable signatures.
Yeah, one of the interesting ones was a vulnerability targeting a learning management platform called aTutor that's apparently still maybe not widely used, but used in some situations. Mainly because it's an open source application, which you can get for free. The unfortunate thing is this application has been abandoned by its developers since around 2019. Its GitHub repository has a few pending pull requests since 2021 that still have not been touched either. And what this means is when someone identifies a vulnerability in it, by being abandoned, it's not going to get patched, and that vulnerability will, in theory, exist until the end of time. So while the trade-off of getting software for free is great, can actually expose some risk when it comes to fixing vulnerabilities in that application. And this isn't the only example of that. We've seen examples of other open source libraries that are maintained by a single individual that can run into trouble if that individual stops maintaining them. There's a great example in the world of JavaScript. There's an extremely popular JavaScript library that's used by almost every website, I'd go ahead and say, because it helps backport new JavaScript functionality to older web browsers that may not support those natively. And the maintainer of this very popular library ended up going to prison for just shy of a year once for something that, relatively inconsequential, well, obviously consequential enough they went to prison, but short enough it was only for a year. But during that year, that library went unmaintained. And this really spawned a discussion in the open source community, both from GitHub's perspective as the place where this repository lives, to NPM, the Node Package Manager Index, where it's served out to developers that are using the library, to try and come up with a solution of what happens if someone like this that maintains a extremely popular library just drops off the face of the earth. How do we continue maintaining that? What is our order of succession for ownership in that particular case? So that's an extreme example. In this case, it was a relatively niche program, but still used enough that it became one of our top exploited applications, at least in terms of detections for the quarter.
Before moving on, Marc, I want to talk about two related questions, just to network attacks in general, not necessarily our findings in the report. The first, which I'll cover really quickly, is one of you have asked, what can you talk about the threat MoveIt? Could WatchGuard prevent it, and what's that all about? If you guys follow the news, I believe, Marc, it probably was months ago, but we did a podcast on this. But basically, MoveIt, it was very popular file transfer software. I'd never actually heard of it or used it, but when this vulnerability came out, it kind of was clear how very popular this was. And there was a 0-day in it that was used by a lot of threat actors, including the Clop ransomware. So that's what the MoveIt vulnerability was. And someone asked, can WatchGuard help? There's tons of ways WatchGuard could help. I will say, by the way, regardless of the vulnerability itself, there's cases where when they try to push payloads, our malware protection, whether endpoint or network, would catch those payloads too. But more specifically, we do have two signatures for that MoveIt vulnerability: the external token authenticator CV, which was a 2023 CV, and the transfer user process pass change request SQL injection. So, what we're talking about in this section of the report, IPS, two of those IPS signatures came out to catch and block that particular MoveIt vulnerability. So we can take care of that. The other thing, Marc, a very good long question that I will summarize as, besides IPS, one of our network security services is basically botnet prevention. It's basically just a big list of well-known botnet command and control IPs and stuff. And the reason it's important is, one, we can block them so that if one of your users somehow gets a bot client, a Trojan that connects to a botnet in your network, and it tries to go out and reach a command and control server, that would be outgoing traffic, we can block that connection, hopefully defanging the botnet even if a computer had it. Now, the question was in the reporting, and this is where I might ask for your help, Mark. In our reporting, basically, it's being claimed that we don't have much differentiation between botnet detection, detecting those IPs from an incoming standpoint. And the person asking is right, that from an incoming standpoint, it's probably less of a big deal because you're probably already blocking whatever port that particular botnet command and control IP is connecting to. So who really cares if it's coming in as long as it's being denied? But because we don't differentiate between incoming and outgoing is more important to know about for the exact reason I said. If you had a computer inside your network that is constantly pinging a botnet command and control server, that's an indicator that it probably has malware on it and needs to be cleaned. So the question, Mark, basically is, our reports don't easily distinguish between the two. To be honest, I haven't looked for a while. So either way, we'll take this to product management. But Mark, is there a way to distinguish between incoming that you know of and outgoing?
I'd say this is an excellent use case for XDR within WatchGuard Cloud. So within XDR, we're able to correlate that activity that the Firebox sees down to the endpoint. If you've got total security as a license for your Firebox, you get a handful of EDR core licenses as well. So a lightweight agent you can install to do that correlation on your endpoints. If you're already an EPDR customer, you've already got all the telemetry we need from it. And so from the XDR portal perspective, we can do that correlation where the Firebox sees a botnet block list and we can identify the exact endpoint that triggered that and even apply automated remediation policies to isolate that system while you go and investigate. If EDR has enough visibility, we can even go in and kill the process as well too, either automatically or manually. So from the reporting standpoint though, I agree. And that's some good feedback we can take back to product management, and also an area that we are hoping to try and add something to within the internet security report itself too. Because the data, the way it's anonymized, we don't always have the best view into the directionality of the detection or the block, but it's an area we've been long hoping to try and add into there. I did see one question pop up about.
Are you going to answer that?
I want to know. Yeah. So the question was something along the lines of not identifying or recognizing any CVE records from WatchGuard.
Yeah, which is
I will say, if you check out psirt.watchguard.com, that's PSIRT, Product Security Incident Response Team.watchguard.com. That is our
linked
list
it in
of
the answer that you should see in questions if you're listening now. So go check the link in the questions.
So psirt.watchguard.com is our public advisory list. We are a certified numbering authority with the CVE program. So we do issue and record our own CVE numbers. So that is the place you'll want to look to identify any advisories for our products and the potential CVEs that are associated with them.
Yeah, we absolutely use CVE, and as a CNA, we can make our own CVEs, which lots of companies don't go to that level of effort. So we definitely use CVE. And I don't know the context of your question as far as were we using it for our vulnerabilities or for IPS. And I will note, I'll put this other link, I'll go ahead and put it in the chat in a second here. But if you go to Security Portal, when I was talking about the two MoveIt vulnerabilities, we do have CVE data in all our signatures too. And the best place to see our IPS signatures is by going to the WatchGuard Security Portal. I think it's securityportal.watchguard.com/threats will get you to the IPS section. And when you look up any type of signature and you actually look at the signature ID, you will find CVE information there. So CVE is the industry standard for kind of making a database of vulnerabilities. We use that, and we also do use CVSS too.
Yep.
Moving on,
right,
go ahead.
No, go for it. Moving on.
The next thing to talk about for IPS network attacks is basically in whether it's malware or IPS, we have a lot of regional data in our report. We don't spend a lot of time going over it on this call, but we even have for some malware threats regional data down to country. But quickly looking at some of the regional trends over the past few years for IPS, here you see a chart that shows the distribution of malware for all regions. Black is Asia Pacific, so all the Asian countries over there. Gray is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and red is the Americas. And as you can see in the past, all the way before Q1 and Q2, the distribution of malware fluctuated quite a bit. And we do normalize this, by the way, for the fireboxes in the region. What I mean by that is sales trends might mean we sell more in Europe than we sell in APAC. And that, of course, would, if you just went by volume, that would mean there would be more, IPS detections in Europe just by the pure amount of fireboxes. But we normalize that so that these trends actually are, ratio to the amount of the fireboxes in the region. One thing we don't have enough historical data for is, do note that in Q2, we're starting to get rid of the outliers. And one of the first things we noticed, while in the past, Americas tended to have more malware, Europe was a common second, and APAC seemed to have the least. Now that we're getting rid of a lot of the outliers and only taking 95% of the non-outlier traffic, we're starting to see kind of a normalization where the amount of IPS detections we see in the region is a lot closer to each other than it was in the past. Obviously, APAC is still a bit behind, whereas Europe and Americas are pretty much neck and neck. But we will be interested to continue to see how this chart changes over the next few quarters now that we've changed the way we normalize our data. But it is interesting to see, where most of the malware, or in this case, where most of the network attacks are coming from in the world. It's always hard for us to kind of do the why to this slide because we don't have enough data. In the cases like in Q2 of 2022, suddenly there were a ton of network traffic, network attacks in the Asia Pacific. It's not always hard for us to know, or it is always hard for us to figure out why without more evidence, but we tend to put hypotheses in the report if you want more information. Before going to the endpoint section though, why don't you talk a little bit about the domains, Mark, unless there's any other questions we should pause on.
Yeah, there's one that was just a follow-up to the botnet connectivity visibility and WatchGuard Cloud. And the question was around, I mentioned EDR core licenses that come with total security on the Firebox. And the question was mostly around the migration from Panda AD360 to WatchGuard EPDR, because for Endpoint to show up in XDR, it needs to be running EPDR, the WatchGuard branded version, and not AD360, the Panda branded version of endpoint protection. When it comes to that migration timeline, it is something engineering is actively working on. We'll have to invite our product manager, Guillermo, onto this at some point in the future to answer the question probably a little more diplomatically than we can. But it is—
Or even exactly. I mean, we generally know that it's a very important, actually, one of the biggest things on the roadmap is different migration features, not only to help you migrate but to make it easy. But the actual schedule is more in the PM's hands.
And then I just saw one other question pop up for EDR core, asking more of a support related question on whether the agent would fail. So failing, I'm assuming like crash or fail to run. I'm not entirely sure. This is definitely a support related question, and I would, off the top of my head, no idea. I haven't heard anything like that, and I'd highly recommend opening a support case in order to—
I agree. The one thing I do want to say here is please install EDR clients, whether core or EPDR, on your domain controller. I get it that domain controllers are very important servers and resource, you worry about that. But to me, those are the servers that is most important to have EDR software like WatchGuard EPDR. But like Mark said, I hadn't heard anything either. So I think that's a very unique support case you should definitely start.
Yep. And I will save the last one for the actual endpoint section because it'll probably be a bit topical in there. But so for top malicious domains, every quarter we look at the connections to malicious destinations that the Firebox blocks with the DNS Watch service. And in the report, we look at 3 specific categories. Now, there's more than just these 3 categories that we block, but the 3 most important ones from our perspective and having visibility into are domains associated with either malware distribution or command and control, domains that are associated specifically with phishing campaigns, and then domains that are otherwise legitimate but have been compromised in order to host some form of malicious activity. When it came to the phishing domains this quarter, there were a few new additions. 2 of them were actually targeted primarily at users out of India, where we originally added them to our feed in February 2023 after finding them hosting content that attempted to mimic popular brands. So they were mostly power tools when I was looking into it, like DeWalt or a Ryobi or whatever, in order to do a form of SEO poisoning where they would cause this malicious website to rank highly. At that point in time, maybe it didn't actually have malicious content on it or not, but once it was ranking high in Google results, they would change the content of the page to serve up something malicious, like a fish, and trick people into giving up credentials while they were still at the top of the list in a Google search result. When it came to malware distribution, there were several websites associated with delivering or facilitating malware botnet command and control connections. But in the compromised website, there was a really interesting one I wanted to highlight. It was right there in the middle, dodgersdigest.com. This one was interesting because it seems like it's just like some guy's WordPress blog that really likes the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team. And so on his WordPress blog, on the legitimate pages for it, it's him discussing the most recent games, sometimes, blasting a poor performance from the pitcher or something on the team. But behind the scenes, a threat actor has compromised this website to host up malicious content, and specifically a malicious version of some Twitter feeds associated with this blog. And when you look at the content, Corey, if you want to go to the next slide, it's a blast from the past in the world of Twitter. So first off, it's got a copyright at the bottom, which you can't see, from 2014, I believe. So that's when they copy pasted the source code into it. They have actually gone to the effort of having the feed itself updated somewhat regularly to give it some credibility, make it look like posts were coming from a few days ago or a few hours ago. But it's got a form on here to get you to either sign up or log into a Twitter account, which in theory would steal your credentials and siphon them off to the threat actor. First big red flag that anyone should spot on this is that it's still called Twitter and not X. It's got the wrong logo in this case. But this is a great example of a pretty innocent WordPress website that unfortunately has been compromised by threat actors to host something malicious. We see this pretty commonly with entirely unrelated sites hosting malware distribution on hidden unlinked pages, because WordPress itself is necessarily a more vulnerable hosting platform than others, but the plugins that you have for WordPress are extremely powerful and have a high number, or a elevated amount of privileges, where if you don't keep them up to date and someone discovers a vulnerability in them, it could allow a threat actor to exploit that, gain access or code execution on the server, and host whatever they want on it. So I guess for time's sake, with only 15 minutes left.
All I heard was sports ball, wah, 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 sports ball, wah, wah. I'm probably losing friends by admitting I don't watch sports. Before we move on for time's sake, there's a lot of interesting questions that I think we'll save for the end to make sure we can get other folks out on time. But I do think one is relevant. We have one person that just asked, remind us of the difference between DNS Watch versus DNS Watch Go. And at a technical level, there is none. The only real difference is DNS Watch runs on the Firebox and protects everyone behind it, whereas DNS Watch Go runs on an endpoint and just protects that single endpoint. But both of them are DNS firewalls. The beauty of DNS-based detection is DNS Watch could technically be anywhere as long as you pointed to our DNS servers. What happens with DNS Watch is our cloud servers become your DNS servers before they actually go to your own. And when your users are looking up some IP like this particular WordPress site to figure out how to resolve dodgersdigest.com, it first hits our DNS server. We see that the IP for that domain is on our block list because of this particular compromise. And we just, instead of returning the right IP to that user that's trying to figure where Dodgers Digest is, we give them the IP to our sinkhole, telling them they tried to reach a site. And because it's DNS based, it works equally well on an endpoint as it does on a routing device like a Firebox. So the only real difference between DNS Watch is DNS Watch's router is Firebox based. It works for all the users behind a Firebox. DNS Watch Go is part of our clients that you put on an endpoint to give you the same protection, even when those clients are outside the Firebox. But now, for time's sake, let's get to the defensive tips for this particular section. And why don't you start off, Mark?
The first one is the follow-up to just what I described, where when it comes to web applications and specifically WordPress in this scenario, make sure you're maintaining a regular patch management process for keeping these applications up to date. If you run a corporate blog on a web hosting operating system like WordPress or Drupal, make sure you're receiving security update notifications from both the platform and any plugins you have installed, because it's very easy for threat actors to potentially identify unpatched vulnerabilities, exploit them, and hide malicious content that preys on the otherwise good reputation of your website. So having a good patch management and vulnerability management program is going to be key for keeping those safe. Corey, you want to nail the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. The second one is avoid abandoned software. In Mark's example of some of the IPS signatures we detected, he mentioned how these were old vulnerabilities in Linux-based software that just is not being maintained anymore. We're big fans of open source. Open source it's great for community projects to deliver things, and sometimes open source becomes packages that the whole world uses for the underlying backend of lots of web-based frameworks and stuff. The problem with open source is sometimes there are community projects started by one or two people that are just happily donating their time to a passion. But if there's no money in it, as that passion dries up and they move on to a different project, no one maintains that software. And while the argument is anyone can kind of submit changes to it, there's been many cases in the past where very popular, often Linux packages that were open source just stops to be maintained. And by the way, this can happen to commercial software too, so it's not an open source only issue. Another thing you'd see in our report is a particular audio product that was more proprietary commercial one that's so popular people are still using it even though the creator is no longer really maintaining it. The problem with that, of course, is that when the creators stop maintaining it, that means even who cares about feature updates? You care about the security updates. As bad guys or researchers find flaws in that software still, because it's still out there on the internet, if no one's actually maintaining it and adding the patches, and Mark just told you it's important to patch, you're not going to get any fixes for that unless you're willing to code them yourself. So we're not ones to always push you to the latest version of Windows. You know, you don't always need the latest software. Sometimes the last revision, if you want to save money, is good, but it has to at least be maintained. It has to at least be getting software patches. Otherwise, you should stay away.
And then finally, to reiterate what we talked about at the very beginning of the Firebox feed section, if you are not inspecting HTTPS encrypted traffic into your perimeter, you're missing out on valuable layers of your network security perimeter. So it does take time to set it up. It's not a quick, easy checkbox. You'll need to do certificate management, but it is well documented and easier to set up now than it may have been in the past. And it is absolutely worth the time investment because the security that you gain in return for enabling this inspection is well worth it and paying it back in dividends. Before we jump into the endpoint section, there was one quick question about testing DNS Watch. Someone asked, is there a domain to test and confirm it's working? It is test.dnswatch.watchguard.com if you want to confirm that DNS Watch is correctly configured for your endpoint with either DNS Watch Go or through the Firebox. So 10 minutes left, Corey. Time for a speed run through endpoint.
Absolutely. And I know one question you can answer in your types of defenses part. So now we're transitioning really to the protections you get from both WatchGuard EPDR and Adaptive Defense 360, which was, they're essentially the same thing. We've done some updates to EPDR2, but they're the acquisition of Panda Security's endpoint software. The first high level trend, it doesn't take a too long to cover. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. But this quarter, lately, when we are showing you the amount of attacks, because we literally have millions and millions of endpoints out there, rather than giving you this huge volume number that's kind of hard to translate what it means, we talk about the attacks blocked for 100,000 machines. So on average this quarter, out of 100,000 machines, there were 981 pieces of malware being blocked. So honestly, that probably translates technically to a little under one threat per endpoint, which is actually good. Like, you really don't want your endpoints to be seeing too much malware. That's probably due to a lot of these devices also being behind things like fireboxes and anything else. I will point out, if it is reaching the endpoint and has got past all your other protections that should keep malware off your computer in the first place before it gets there, those 981 things are probably the more sophisticated things you should worry about. The next thing I want to talk about, essentially our takeaway, is attacks have become more widespread in Q2. And what we mean by that is they're affecting more, like a single hash, a single particular exact same variant of malware is affecting more computers rather than each individual computer only getting a specific threat itself. So how do we know this? Here you can see a chart we've shown between Q1 and Q2. And to explain it a little, this is a number of malware hits, I believe, still per 100,000 machines, but it's unique hashes, unique signatures for malware that hit just one machine and no other machine in the world, hit 2 to 5 machines, hit 5 to 10 machines, 10 to 50 machines, and more. And as you can see, between Q1 and Q2, there is a lot of malware out there that hits just one machine in the world. That actually is kind of, it goes with our 0-day number. It talks about malware evasion. Bad guys are using a lot of packing encrypting. You might hear there's a piece of ransomware called Clop ransomware, and the Clop group makes some ransomware. You might think it's just one piece of malware. Really, these bad guys are using packing encrypting techniques to take that binary and jumble up the digital bits, even though technically it's still the same threat, so that it looks different from a binary pattern standpoint. So when you're looking at the hits for one machine, that means they're the only machine that is seeing that hash. Still, the huge majority of attacks we're detecting are just seen on one machine. So that means packing encrypting, creating specialized malware packages for each victim is still high. But as you can also see, it dropped quite a bit between Q1 and Q2. And what has gone up on the flip side is malware that hits 2 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 to 50 machines. We've seen increases in malware that actually is not just touching one computer, but that hash is actually hitting a lot of computers. So that just means that some threat actors out there are kind of spamming their singular malware package to lots of machines out there. Not sure if you have anything to add, Mark, otherwise I'll move to your section.
Now let's move on to the next one. So when it comes to malware detections on the endpoint, EPDR has multiple layers within itself on how it can detect and block specific threats. At the bulk of the threats that we detected and blocked for the quarter were actually caught by the signature and rules-based engine within EPDR. Around 50% of all the malware we saw was blocked by a signature almost immediately. Beyond that, we've got rules that are up and hosted in the collective intelligence platform in the cloud, based off of malware heuristics or behaviors that can detect and block certain threats too. Around 18% of all files were processed by the 8360 cloud and blocked because of that. We also have behavioral and machine learning models, or I'm sorry, artificial intelligence within the endpoint that can proactively identify
you call it the
threats.
buzzword. It's not just machine learning, it's artificial intelligence for sure, right, Mark?
It's artificial intelligence. And around 10% of malicious files were caught and blocked using those engines. We also have the manual attestation service behind the scenes backing all of this up. And the reality is only around 0.02% of all brand new files end up with a human being that has to go and reverse engineer and identify definitively whether it's bad or good. But our entire ecosystem benefits from that manual analysis. And that's why, even though 0.02% end up with a human for manual attestation, around 10% of all the threats we blocked in the quarter ended up being blocked as a result of that analysis. And then rounding out the pack, around 1% were blocked using just digital signatures. So effectively a known list of bad cryptographic signatures or compromised keys that malware authors are using to try and sign and have technically valid but either expired or revoked certificates for their malware payloads.
So
Corey,
it's not one of the types of detections we describe here, but I did want to take the opportunity to try to answer one question. I think it makes kind of sense here. One person asks, they mentioned EPDR, but Firebox too, but how we do it detecting keystroke loggers. I can start, Mark. I'm sure you could add more. From a Firebox level, we certainly do, but only as malware payloads, only if the keystroke logger arrives as a malware payload. There's lots of different ways to do keystroke logging. Some might even use SDKs and normal, DLLs of the system itself. But if it comes down in a payload, there's a chance a Firebox can detect it. Obviously, EPDR has multiple different ways too to catch those payload-based keystroke loggers as well. But there's always new techniques. I will say, I believe some of our the other thing EPDR does besides just looking for malicious payloads, including keystroke loggers, is we look for malicious techniques happening on a computer, indicators of attack and exploit detection. So things like process hollowing, inline memory injection, things like that. And there are keyload loggers or keystroke techniques that might do something exploity that our exploit detection detects. Mark, I don't know if you have any more nuance to that particular answer while we're talking about EPDR.
More nuance than something exploity that exploit detection can.
Add some detail beyond process injection and other things are good ways to load keystroke loggers, so we can detect often the techniques they use to load them.
Exactly. I think just to reiterate what Corey was saying is EPDR goes beyond, and specifically the EDR portion of EPDR goes beyond just detecting malware threats. It goes into detecting common exploit avenues as well. And that is how we would potentially catch some of these more advanced or evasive threats on the endpoint. Corey, you want to nail one more section, then we'll see what questions we can get at the end?
Yes, absolutely. So the other thing we look at is the different delivery vectors for malware. In past reports, almost over 90% of malware was delivered via scripts. And of that 90%, another 90% of those scripts typically was PowerShell, although it could be VB script, Python, and other things too. So we basically, is malware being delivered by some script like PowerShell? Is it coming via exploiting your browser? Is it an Office document, a PDF document? Is it piracy software like the KMS tools used to pirate Windows products? Or is it just some sort of malicious Windows binary? The big new thing in this report is while it was primarily mostly scripts, that was the most of the story, that has dropped 41%. It's still obviously 74% of malware is delivered by scripts, but this quarter we saw a huge growth, 30% in just malicious Windows-based binaries being the way that malware was delivered. So very interesting. I'm going to move on for time's sake. Even though scripts is dropped, the fact that it is the majority, I always like to point out living off the land techniques here. The reason I think scripts are being used to deliver a malware is living off the land techniques are using core legitimate parts of your operating system. In Windows, things like PowerShell or specific Windows executables that do things like strututil or other things to do things malicious. If I can gain some sort of control of your computer through a legitimate tool like PowerShell, if I can get PowerShell to run under a context, maybe then I can do some of the staging necessary to turn off some of your security protections before I deliver the malware. So we believe scripts is high because people are using living off the land attacks. But with that, let's get to final protection, because I want to get to some questions. The first summary tip for the report is still abandon abandonware. We just wanted to use some alliteration and say that tip again, but you kind of already heard this tip. If a vendor is not supporting their software anymore, even if it's great software, it's available and you like it, it really is probably time to get rid of it because you're not going to get security patches. If you absolutely have to have it, realize that it's unpatched, so you're going to have to put a lot of mitigations around it to protect it. Off to you,
Next
Mark.
up is, yeah, hardening your Linux servers. So I feel like the stigma has probably gone at this point, or the assumption has gone at this point that Mac OS and Linux don't get malware. That is absolutely not true. In fact, we've seen many of our top threats this quarter, specifically targeting Linux-based systems as well. So make sure that you not only have defensive controls in place on these systems, but you take steps to harden them too. That means disabling unneeded or exposed services, making sure those aren't exposed directly to the internet, using a VPN into an organization instead of just exposing SSH out publicly, ensuring you've got strong credentials and preferably MFA behind the scenes. There's different steps you can take to protect these systems and set them up to make them as secure or more secure than Windows-based systems too, and protect against some of the threats that we saw in the quarter.
Cool, and I'll be very quick with the last tip. Look at your defenses with a new perspective. As I mentioned, the past 2 quarters, we've been stirring the pot with our same data, trying to look at it with a more professional statistical analysis techniques, just to see if we can find new trends. And the point of that is to try to find new ways, new things that we can find that attackers are doing, where we can offer new ways to protect yourself. But you should do the same with your defenses every once in a while. Depending on the size of your organization, whether you have an MSP or MSSP handling your security for you, or if you're small and you're just doing it yourself as an IT team, you may sometimes set and forget some security appliances and security controls. It's easy to do. Once you have them configured and they seem to be doing well, you might not think about them. But let's take a Firebox, for instance. You know, as your IT department has new projects, maybe someone puts up a test server, you open up a port on your Firebox to give access so that some external partner can access it for a month. But then you forget that policy's there and you leave it. When's the last time you've gone through your policies and made sure they're not any outdated policies you don't use? You can use our policy mapper tool to kind of see which of your policies is used the most versus which of your policies haven't been touched for a long time. Looking at your defenses with a new perspective will allow you to go clean up those gaps. Another example might be, identity buildup. As you're managing your domain controller in your Active Directory, you probably often have service accounts or privileged accounts you throw in quickly so that different internal tools and stuff can do something privileged. But when's the last time you've gone in and seen how many domain controller accounts you have, how many service accounts that have admin privilege, and questioned, do I still need that? Every single privileged account or domain controller, or, domain admin account is a danger. So go through and weed through all your policy, make sure it still makes sense and get rid of what doesn't. So with that, thank you for your time. Sorry we went a bit over. We will stick around a little bit to try to answer some of the questions, but otherwise have a great day and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
With that, Mark, is there anything you've looked at that you're going to jump on?
There's a couple I want to hit. So it would not be a Marc and Corey webinar if we didn't go over with Q&A. So thank you for folks that do stick around for any questions you want answered. One of them first, though, is someone pointing out the friction they've gotten from colleagues on enabling HTTPS inspection and saying, what about the edge cases of mobile devices and direct access VPN solutions? One thing we forgot to mention earlier is it's not a all or nothing feature on the Firebox. You can absolutely custom tailor it towards specific network segments. So maybe for your guest network, well, absolutely for your guest network, but maybe even the network your mobile devices connect to, you don't enable it. Whereas your traditional server infrastructure that might be connecting out in more of a controlled manner, maybe you do enable it there. I would highly recommend as you do roll it out, do it in a controlled manner. With just small groups to start with, identify any unique applications or connection types in your organization you may need to handle before rolling it out to wider audiences. But short answer is it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and you should absolutely enable it where you can easily, and then come up with plans for areas where maybe it takes a little bit more work to distribute certificates over time. There was another
Can I answer
question
it?
about,
Let's do a quick
yeah,
flame war one that I just got rid of. Windows, Mac, or Linux? And I will answer it by saying I think Mark and I are probably the nerds that say all of the above. We use Macs for work. I have multiple Windows computers for gaming and personal, and Macs at home. And I think both of us have multiple Linux servers at home. So all of the above. You're probably answering for security though, and I would have to say it's probably mostly equal. It's more probably like none of them is that much more secure than the other. Linux and Mac were much better at separating true root from the top admin user back in the day, but now that Windows has UAC, they all do a pretty good job of that. All of them have finally got to the point where they have good security disclosure and good response to the community. I will say there's downsides to it, but there's benefits to Mac's closed ecosystem. Mac is trying to own the world and make you only get stuff through them, and they're trying to probably get rid of third-party developers that don't publish through them more and more as time goes on. The benefit is security. The fact that they vet stuff even for their primary OS, not just talking mobile is good, but it means less configurability for others. But the truth is, I think all the operating systems are pretty good now, but they all have issues. So don't think that one's really better than the other. Did you have a different?
I'm just surprised that's coming from the guy that's wearing an Apple Watch with an iPhone in his pocket and a Mac on his desktop and probably on his couch. And
That's
I've
more
only had
about
a
how
watch for
lazy
years.
people that used to want to tweak stuff, as we get old, I'm almost 50, we don't want to, it just has to all stay in the same place. I don't need to power tweak my Android phone, nor get rid of the bloatware that comes with all of those external Android phones anyways.
So there's a good point. There's a couple of things I want to hit. First off, someone asking again, where's the setting to turn on the sharing info feature on your fireboxes? It's under either the general settings or global settings. It's two separate names for the same thing, depending on if you're in the web UI or WatchGuard system manager with policy manager. But if you go to device settings, general settings, or global settings, you'll see the checkbox in there for send device feedback to WatchGuard. Another question I saw was if we're using EPDR, should we be using DNS Watch Go as well? As of right now, they are two separate agents that you would need to install. I would recommend having multiple layers of security. DNS Watch Go does a great job of protecting against new phishing threats. That said, there is I'm not sure if it's public roadmap, but there is a roadmap of unifying them into a single agent. Hopefully on the short-term horizon, so you won't need those two separate agents. And then there was another question
I
about
can
roadmap
answer,
for
sorry.
Panda
I was going
email
to answer really
protection.
quickly. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
One person mentioned, this is super quick, is there anything talking about EPDR software between WatchGuards and Sentinel-1? I think you asked if it's on our website. I'm not aware of anything on our website, but if you contact our sales organization, we do have internal documents that we can show you a comparison between us and Sentinel-1 software. I
Yeah.
won't hammer any other EPDR products. Sentinel-1 software is very good too, but we do have a lot of differentiation as well. So more sales question than something me and Mark handle.
So question about roadmap for Panda email protection in WatchGuard Cloud. I believe the WatchGuard email protection is now GA and available, but if you're saying under the same pane of glass, I'm not sure if we have a definitive roadmap on that sort of integration quite yet, but it is definitely on product management's plate to take a look at. There was another question about protecting endpoints, specifically Chromebooks in school versus home. This is a great use case for DNS Watch Go, by the way. Not only does DNS Watch Go protect against phishing and malware, botnet command and control, it also includes the same URL content filtering that we have powering on the Firebox for web blocker. So you can still protect users regardless of their location from going to malicious websites or destinations. And DNS Watch Go does work on Chrome OS. I'm not sure what the roadmap is off the top of my head for EPDR on Chrome OS and what the plan is for that. Corey, any other questions in here you think we should sift out? I'm not seeing a whole lot. Oh, did we just lose Corey? Oh, this is fantastic. I can talk without him hearing me and say whatever the heck I want. So while Corey is potentially reconnecting, there was one question about where did that go? Around migration from LAN to cloud, specifically in AWS as an example,
I
and what the
think we
Firebox
should
is.
go just for
Oh,
time. We might
Corey's
be able
back.
to answer, but I did see one that wanted our thoughts on setting it up. To have probably turn on very quick. Oh,
All right,
can
you
you
are
hear
back,
me?
Corey.
I suddenly heard
Yes.
Mark talking. Don't know if I'm having issues. Oh, I was going to say, I don't know where I ended up, but one question was wanting thoughts about how to set up WatchGuard services for new customers and stuff, just ordering or recommendations. If you can hear me, I would start with IPS botnet command and control, mostly because they don't need specialized policies. They don't need proxies. It's just a matter of setting a check mark and you're off to the games. They don't cause that much disruption. Then I would work on all of the anti-malware services, APT blocker, GAV, and IAV, depending on what license you have. Those ones require proxies. So for those, you'll have to add proxy policies to your services unless you made that part of your quick setup wizard. And proxies sometimes take a little bit of configuration themselves before you even turn on the services. So I would do those next. DNS watch is actually an easy turn on too. You could probably do DNS watch with IPS because it's literally a checkbox. So IPS, botnet, command and control, and DNS, just turn it on. It's easy. Do all the malware services next because they require proxies. And really, once you have GAV enabled, turning on the other ones are fine. With that, though, if there are more questions, we might try to answer them in email and stuff. But thank you for your time. We've
Yeah.
gone quite a bit over.
Thank you all.